Parks Victoria acknowledges traditional owners throughout Victoria and pays respect to their culture and elders past, present and future. This episode of Closer to Nature was recorded in Wilson's Promontory National Park. The area is a highly significant living cultural landscape for the Gunai Kurnai, Boon Wurrung and Bunurong people. Parks Victoria respects the deep and continuing connection that traditional owners have to the lands and waters of Victoria, and we recognise their ongoing role in caring for country.
We've lost the last 20,000 years worth of culture and heritage probably, because this calcarenite, and at the moment it's holding a lot of these large dunes stable, but it is slowly being eroded. And in the last, I'd say 8 months, we've had about 4 or 5 massive slips of those rocks. And each time that happens, it's destabilising those dune systems as well. Sandstone used to run all the way out past the islands, and it's just in a natural process. So that's not necessarily climate change, that's just a natural process that has eroded out. But what we're noticing now is a speeding up of that process. And so these cultural sites are disappearing at a faster rate than what we have seen previously.
Welcome to Closer to Nature, a Parks Victoria podcast where we look at how climate change is impacting the natural environment within our parks in Victoria, and what we're doing to help protect nature and all of our rich native plants and animals. I'm Dr. Mark Norman, Chief Scientist, Conservation and Climate Action at Parks Victoria. In this episode, we're looking at the impact climate change is having on Indigenous heritage and culture.
Go on, Bunna. You and Nadi Clinton. Dirramadillinya Baru Wiradjuri. That was me announcing myself. My name's Clinton. I've welcomed you here, and I'm a proud Wiradjuri man.
This is Clinton Morton.
The role I'm currently in is traditional owner partnerships. So I work for Parks Victoria, but my main role is to engage with the 3 traditional owner groups who claim association with this country, and then also to be an intermediary between the traditional owner groups and Parks Victoria as well.
Clinton is based at Wilson's Promontory National Park, the southernmost point of the Australian mainland. It's a really special place for a range of reasons, and Parks Victoria is doing a huge amount of work there to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
We're currently at Derby River, and Derby River is a catchment area from the Prom, and it catches probably somewhere between 60 and 70% of the rainfall that hits Wilson's Prom itself, or otherwise known as Yuruk, that's the Gunai Kurnai word for the Prom, or Wamun, which is the Bunurong Boon Wurrung word for Wilson's Prom. This is a really amazing place at Wilson's Prom where we move from one environment to the other environment. So to our south, it's all granite country. Everything is all big granite boulders and monoliths. And looking north, we're looking at calcarenite sands and sands that have been built up that generally come moving in from the west. So this area to our north is what's known as the isthmus. So that's that sandy stretch that hooks Wilson's Prom itself, the granite, to the mainland. And that's where we're standing at the moment. And this area here is actually a very dynamic area where we have that influence between catchment flows, so when we get big floods come through and high rain events, and then when we have those storm surges. So this is an area that's very good for teaching people about the effects of climate change because we can actually see it happening very easily. The main thing that we're noticing here at Wilson's Prom is the impact on the coastline. That's where the most action is always taking place. You know, waves, rain, all those things. And it's a natural part of how the environment operates. Sand dunes move, sand spits move, all that. So we've just at the top of the Prom here, the northern end, our western boundary sits against Shallow Inlet. And people may know Sandy Point, the little suburb on the other side of that. Over the last couple of years, the river mouth is consistently moving south, and we've just recently had that mapped as part of our coastal hazard assessment, which feeds into our landscape management plan. So that decides how we're going to try and manage these things into the future. That river mouth is moving south at 50 metres a year. Right, so that's quite substantial. So that river mouth is travelling south and the sand is moving. But what it's doing is it's cutting into that northern end of the prom. And so we're losing large amounts of what was vegetated sand dunes. They're now completely gone. In some places, you've got a bank where the river mouth is cutting that out that's like 15, 20 metres high. And as you're walking along there, you're just watching the sand just collapse with its trees and everything and hit the ground. Now, that is part of a natural process in itself as well, but it's been exasperated. So at one time, the river mouth used to punch straight out.
These accelerating changes to the coastline are taking a big toll on Aboriginal culture and heritage found in Wilson's Promontory. But Clinton and his team are doing everything they can to protect these cultural sites and objects.
Culture and heritage I'm referring to at the moment is the tangible items. It's the physical things that are still visible today, whether they be middens, which are generally full of shells but sometimes contain burials, stone axes, stone tools, scar trees, rock art. We don't actually have any recorded rock art down here at the prom. Doesn't mean it's not there, because Wilson's Prom itself, less than 1% has been surveyed for Aboriginal culture and heritage. And most of those sites were recorded or around the 1980s. So their georeferencing's out. The data is very, very minimal. And then we have intangible culture and heritage, which is, the stories and everything that underlies how people existed in this environment. At the moment, at Wilson's Prom, we don't ask the traditional owners to share any of their intangible heritage, because there are things going on, native title cases that it's something that they don't feel comfortable sharing at the moment. So we're focusing on how do we protect that tangible heritage, or how do we manage it is probably a better way to phrase it, because sometimes you just have to allow the natural process to do what it does. There's not much that we can do sometimes.
The middens, particularly those on the coast, are being heavily impacted by the increasing frequency and severity of storm events, rising sea levels, and more flood events, all of them manifestations of climate change.
We now have Aboriginal sites that were recorded in the 1980s that are close to 400 or 500 metres out to sea now. They're gone. The landscape is gone. Because of the nature of those sites as well, they were predominantly midden sites. They've been destroyed. Even if you were to do undersea archaeology, you wouldn't be able to find these things again, just because the nature of the material. Shells turn into sand, funnily enough.
Before we go any further, let's talk about what a midden is exactly.
That's how they were first described by archaeologists. And midden actually means rubbish tip. It was taken from the European version of archaeology. Obviously, it was laid over here. And I believe that was like a Scandinavian, term that was used for the midden, which is like your crap pile. And most people, we look around the world, up until very recently, you would find the closest gully to your house, and that's where you would throw everything. And so that's sort of where the word midden has come from. It doesn't translate very well. So a midden is basically a site where you can see the evidence of harvesting of seafood. So, and the things that exist and last the longest out of that process are generally shells. So that doesn't mean there wouldn't have been other things mixed in with that, but the shells or the stone tools or fragments of stone tools, so we refer to them as artefacts, but a lot of the time we find them in association with the midden. It's pretty easy to work out where they're going to be, and why they're there is because that's where the food was. So where we look at the moment, and a lot of our middens are now on the frontal dunes that are exposed and near the beach, that's not how it would have been. They would have been that gap between the first dune and the second dune. Nobody wants to sit on the beach and try and eat shellfish unless you really like eating just mouthfuls of sand being blown around. So you'd move off that little bit behind. The largest ones we have along the coastline, because that's the most accessible seafood. Aboriginal people did travel in and out. Sometimes they were more permanent in one area than another, but, they were transient at times. A lot of time when you'd come back and sit at the same site that a previous family member had been sitting there eating. You'd been directed to that site. And that's why we sometimes find burials in there as well, in those midden sites. And so people sort of go, oh, that's a bit, but we go to the cemetery and we lay flowers and we do all these sorts of things for our ancestors. And that sort of same process would be undertaken when you would come back to that area again. an old auntie or uncle's buried in there, you're sitting there retelling the stories of them and their life and the stories they've passed on to you. And that continues that connection on. So a midden to traditional owners is a very spiritual place as much as it's a site of physical evidence that shows occupations. We have one midden along the west coast of the Prom here that is 55 hectares for one midden. That's roughly close enough to 200 acres just of shells. So you imagine how many oysters will you eat? Most people will get to about, probably if you say 30, you're probably pretty well fed by then. And then you're looking at these layers and layers and layers of midden. So 55 hectares worth in the actual perimeter. But then in some of these areas, we don't know how deep they go down. And these are shells that have been piled on other shells while they're being cooked. So they break down, they fracture down, they compact down. So these things are so old. So you've got the same groups of people coming back to the same areas over thousands of years and thousands of people.
But many of these middens are now being eroded or even lost completely as the dunes they were found on disappear into the ocean.
We've recently had ancestral remains exposed out of a midden, and that's been caused by that catchment flow in conjunction with the tidal wash. And that's impacted and undercut this midden. And this sort of feeds into as well our management strategies when dealing with cultural sites. So if we think that cultural site is going to be disturbed and destroyed, what are we going to choose to do in that situation? So if we choose to go in and try and protect what's there and say we go, okay, we're going to do a dig here and we're going to gather back what we can so we can protect it somewhere else. That's making a deliberate choice to go in and potentially disturb someone's burial site. And they've been buried with proper ceremony and protocol. And you're breaking that. Yet if you don't make those hard decisions, then they may just be washed away forever. So then these are decisions for traditional owners. These decisions are not decided by Parks Victoria. How the traditional owners' ancestors are looked after, that needs to be guided 100% by the traditional owners.
Clinton and his Parks Victoria colleagues work closely with the traditional owner groups of the area to work through these difficult decisions.
So down here at the Prom, we have 3 separate traditional owner groups that claim association with the country. That's the Gunai Kurnai, and specifically the Bratungalung clan of the Gunai Kurnai. We have Bunurong and we have Boonwurrung. So Parks Victoria has made a commitment to engage with all 3 parties 100% equally. We've made a very clear commitment that at all points we will engage with the traditional owners to find out, first off for them to have a look at what we're planning to do and provide comment, but then also provide guidance as to how we can do things better in the future.
As Clinton puts it, this is the traditional owners' culture, history and ancestors, and it is their connection, knowledge and decisions that are so important. Their people have witnessed, experienced and lived in this changing landscape over thousands and thousands of years.
I think there's a lot there that traditional owner knowledge can actually help us deal with climate change, because we're talking about people who have gone through ice ages. 40,000 years ago you could walk to Tassie. You imagine the change in the environment while that process was going on, with that massive sea level rise over like a 7,000 year period where everything would have changed. So it's part about adapting. It's also accepting what's happening. The only way you can really get yourself geared to deal with how you're going to adapt to a changing environment is to accept what's going on. There's a huge amount of wealth and knowledge there, because it's not just about what we can do to fix climate change, because a lot of the time there isn't that much that we can actually do on an individual basis. It's how do we accept it and then come up ways to adapt to it. And that's not just for us, how do we make places where we can allow the animals time to adapt? Because although there was climate change, and there always has been climate change, we live in a world that does change. What we're seeing now is a speeding up of the time process. Instead of something taking thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, we're now seeing it right before our eyes. And these things are changing in 20, 30 years. Swamps are disappearing, or whole beach fronts are gone. Where there used to be sand, there's now just rock. There's nothing there. So we can't bring those things back. But what we can do is try and create an environment that's conducive to allowing, not just humans to thrive, but everything else that we rely on in the environment and the ecosystem.
Wilson's Promontory is a critical landscape when considering climate change because it's bathed in the cool surrounding waters of Bass Strait. This naturally buffers it from heat and dry extremes and makes it 5 to 10 degrees cooler than the adjacent mainland. But it doesn't mean it's immune to climate change impacts.
2010 is a great example. That was a time that Wilson's Prom got hit by a massive storm cell, and now don't hold me 100% to the numbers, but I believe it was between 400 and 600 mil of rain landed in 24 hours.
A huge amount of rain fell in just 24 hours, a third of the average annual rainfall for the park. It triggered landslides, uprooted century-old trees and caused widespread flooding. Hundreds of people were evacuated by helicopter.
And we had landslips and trees over, and most of the walking tracks around here, the bridge that you came over to get to this spot, Derby Bridge, that was blown out. Everyone who was here at that time had to be choppered out, and it took, years and years of rebuilding to get this place back open again. That was like a really big early warning sign. So that hadn't been experienced down here at all before. It was a completely different kind of weather pattern that nobody had seen here before. And in the last couple of days, we're feeling the effects of that. We've got places all over Victoria that have just been completely smashed by different weather systems than we're used to seeing. They're behaving in a different way. And that's what we had with that flood that hit here. And then every time now we do get a large rain event, we're getting erosion on the river here.
As climate and extreme weather events increase, so too do our efforts to manage and care for our parks. As Clinton says, we can all learn from the oldest continuous cultures on Earth by sitting, listening and sharing knowledge with traditional owners about the ways they care for country and the philosophy behind it.
The individual tool that you would use to undertake any activity is probably more governed by the underlying philosophy of it. And I think that's probably, the main physical tool was fire. But that didn't mean that Aboriginal people didn't interact with their environment in different ways either. So more than it being an actual strategy or a thing, fire was the main tool overall. But fire was so much more than that as well. Fire was an everyday thing. That's what kept you warm. It's what you cooked your food on. It's the whole life of the community existed around fire. Fire was integral to everything. But so I think the main thing is it's that underlying strategy is the important thing. So when you were looking after your environment, you weren't just concerned about what was best for you or your family. You actually have obligations to the plants, to the animals. So yes, I'm setting this up so that this bit of area is going to supply me regular food for my family. But just over here, there's burn country and then there's non-burn country. There was bits of the country that were never to be burnt. And some bits of country, if you burn it any more than, say, every 40 or 60 years, you'll actually destroy what's there. But then if you don't burn it that 60 years, you'll lose what's there as well. And that environment can be sitting right against something that needs to be burnt once every 18 months to keep that stable. So that's that management process. So the fire was the tool, but the underlying philosophy is the thing that actually has the real power. That's where all the knowledge is held, and that can guide our decisions. Not necessarily our behaviour, but our decisions.
So can we find a way to protect these sites, and how can it be done?
So middens, yeah, they can be protected. There's many, many sites where it has been done. Generally, it comes down to, revegetation, creating the right environment where plants can take off and restabilise that environment again. Once it's gone, it's gone. You can't reproduce this. You can't stand a scar tree back up. Or once it's burnt, you can't just make it reappear. Once an ancestral remains has been destroyed or moved to a museum or whatever's happened, that's now completely changed. You can never take it back to what it was.
As Clinton's already said, we can't always save these important cultural sites, especially with the increasing frequency and severity of climate changes. There are many situations where no matter what we do, natural and cultural values will be lost. Through partnerships and programs, we're working to preserve these sites however we can.
We know we're losing cultural sites here at the Prom. We know that that's happening through the natural process of sea level rise, inundation, the effects of climate change. And the money, the resources, the time to actually go out and completely protect these sites and make sure they're never impacted is so massively huge that there's no hope of that really happening realistically. But if we put the time and the money into actually finding out exactly what is here, and we use the technology that's now available to us today to capture this information, whether it's drone footage or LiDAR or whatever, there's all these different techniques that we can use now. But especially drone footage is going to be extremely valuable. Once we can capture that information then can be fed into different systems.
This idea of capturing footage and virtual digital records of these sites in order to preserve their cultural significance and knowledge came from one of the traditional owners working on country with Clinton.
He's like, well, we know we can't protect every shell in every midden, but if we can capture the information, what things are looking like now, and then also capture it over time as well, but we've got virtual reality now. We could actually create a way where in 50, 60 years' time, people through virtual reality will actually be able to go back and experience those cultural sites as they are today. So even though we may lose them physically and we may be only able to salvage some parts of them, we can still have that knowledge and that experience, and that story can still be passed down to future generations for them to see exactly what the impact of everyone, living and thriving in this place, the physical signs, although they might be gone, they'll still be there as well.
One of our great collective challenges is that these ancient sites are only just being rediscovered at a time that climate change is increasingly threatening them. Through the combination of physical protection and/or rescue and/or use of digital innovations, we're all striving to minimise the losses and keep cultural connections and knowledge alive into the future. This is the critical work for the traditional custodians of Yurik Wamoon, Parks Victoria and the wider community. By building a shared understanding of this cultural landscape and biocultural knowledge, we can work together to make the right collective decisions for the future of Wilson's Promontory. A great example is traditional owners leading a project to take sediment cores around the Prom that will show the fire history and, through pollen analysis, the plant communities that have been present and have changed over thousands of years. This critical information can then drive habitat restoration projects, for example, seeding choices for restoring tall forests. Similarly, understanding the animal species present in middens can help us identify the species of wildlife lost from the Prom since colonisation that could be brought back through managed reintroductions as part of the Prom Sanctuary project. When it comes to visiting our parks, what can you, the visitor, know and do? It's absolutely essential that we don't disturb or interfere with middens and other cultural object sites. Once disturbed or mixed up, this information's lost forever. That's why an easy way to respect these sites is to stick to the formed tracks and paths. That way there's no chance you might accidentally walk on and disturb hugely important cultural sites such as middens. Thanks for listening to Closer to Nature. I'm Mark Norman, and thanks to my guest Clinton Morton for sharing his great knowledge with us. In our next episode, we talk about the impact of visitors in our parks, and volunteers tell us about what spending time in the bush means to them.
I remember the first time I saw a powerful owl. That was a great thrill, and those moments stay with you because it's not every day that you see something, a wonderful, fascinating species for the first time.
This episode was produced by Liz McKenzie, Ben Francischelli, Paddy Norton, and hosted by me, Dr. Mark Norman. Production and sound design by Laura Briley-Newton from Audiocraft, and production support from Olivia O'Flynn, also from Audiocraft. We'd love to know what you think, so please subscribe to Closer to Nature and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.